Few aspects of Viking warfare are as overlooked as their mastery of environmental acoustics, the subtle arts of stealth, and the use of natural materials not just for shelter, but for tactical advantage. Most accounts of Viking raids emphasize the long ships, the suddenness of attack, or the violence of their engagements. What rarely makes it into popular histories is how deeply these communities understood their surroundings, and how they transformed natural resources into tools of survival and strategy. Today we're going to examine one of the most ingenious and often forgotten techniques: how Vikings used forest moss to construct timber walls that absorbed sound, concealing movement and protecting settlements. If you are interested in the mechanics of survival, historical engineering, or overlooked military strategies, this story has layers worth unpacking. And if you value this kind of detail-driven historical analysis, take a moment to subscribe now so you won't miss further explorations of forgotten tactics and lessons from the past. The quiet efficiency of moss was never accidental. Vikings did not see the world in purely offensive terms. They were acutely aware that survival depended on preparation, concealment, and the ability to control the environment. Dense northern European forests were both a shield and a barrier. Timber was abundant, but untreated wood carries a sound that travels far. A footstep, a shifting log, or the movement of a door could betray an entire settlement. Moss, collected from swampy glades and shaded groves, offered a simple but powerful solution. Applied between timbers, it filled cracks and irregularities, deadening sound and creating a barrier that insulated against both weather and detection. Archaeological studies, especially in sites along the Norwegian and Danish coasts, show remnants of preserved moss within timber structures. These are not random traces. They indicate a consistent practice across centuries. In essence, Vikings were early acoustic engineers. They recognized that even the quietest approach could be disrupted by the materials of construction themselves. Moss walls turned ordinary longhouses and fortifications into structures that absorbed sound, making the movements of inhabitants less detectable to both human and animal observers. Moss was part of a broader understanding of tactical forestry. Vikings did not just rely on timber and moss. They curated the surrounding forests to serve defensive and survival purposes. Trees were felled selectively to provide clear lines of sight without exposing vulnerable paths. Underbrush was maintained or cleared depending on the intended use of the site. Moss provided a dual function in this ecosystem, as insulation for sound and as a stabilizer for walls, helping timber structures resist moisture while remaining lightweight. In regions where winter snows and spring thaw could destabilize buildings, moss-filled walls prevented gaps from widening, maintaining both the integrity and the silence of a fortification. The practical lesson here extends beyond architecture. Survival in marginal conditions, cold, damp, or threatened by enemy presence, depends on attention to subtle environmental interactions. A misstep in clearing the wrong area, or a poorly insulated wall, could mean exposure. The Vikings' use of moss exemplifies this mindset: small, deliberate interventions in the landscape that magnified both defensive and practical outcomes. Sound and movement dictated battlefield perception before the era of firearms. Before gunpowder made noise unavoidable, sound was one of the primary determinants of survival and success in conflict. A raiding party moving through the forest, a sentry-shifting position, or even the approach of livestock could alert opponents long before visual contact. Historians often emphasize strategy, numbers, and leadership, but the Vikings' use of acoustic camouflage reminds us that successful tactics depended on controlling how environments transmitted information. Moss-filled walls represent an early form of passive stealth technology, kind of like modern soundproofing or military camouflage. There are accounts from early chroniclers noting that Viking fortifications could be approached almost undetected, with raiding parties able to stage inside villages without drawing attention until the last moment. While these accounts can be colored by myth, they align with what we know from material evidence. Timber walls with moss layers significantly reduced sound transmission. In practical terms, this could make the difference between surviving a rival raid or being overwhelmed before one could respond. The choice of moss was deliberate, not convenient. Not all mosses were equal, you know. The Vikings sought varieties that were both compressible and durable, capable of absorbing sound without rotting quickly in damp conditions. Peat mosses, for example, could be harvested from bogs and retained their structure when dried. Cushion mosses, often found in shaded forest areas, provided more elasticity and filled irregular gaps. By combining different species, builders could create composite barriers that were resilient, lightweight, and acoustically effective. This attention to detail really reflects a broader pattern in Viking material culture. Weapons were tempered precisely, sails were treated to resist wind and water, and boats were designed for both speed and stealth. Moss in the walls is part of the same continuum, a carefully studied low-tech solution to a high-stakes problem. For modern survivalists or historical reenactors, the lesson is clear: mastery of local resources can multiply effectiveness far beyond brute strength. This practice influenced more than just Viking settlements. Sound-dampening construction techniques persisted into later European fortification strategies. Medieval builders, particularly in northern Europe, continued to use moss, straw, and other organic fillers to insulate timber walls and absorb sound, suggesting that early Viking methods were observed and adapted. Understanding the acoustic properties of structures became increasingly important as castle design evolved to include hidden passages, postern gates, and defensive interiors where stealth could, at times, determine outcomes. It's also worth noting the indirect influence on military doctrine. When armies in the High Middle Ages emphasized fortified encampments and silent night watches, they were building on practices honed in part by earlier Northern European communities. Acoustic considerations, once viewed as marginal, were actually deeply practical. Vikings demonstrated that tactical advantage could come not only from the blade or the spear, but from controlling perception itself. We can draw modern lessons from this historical insight. For survivalists, architects, and even modern military planners, the Viking example is, well, pretty instructive. Success in challenging or hostile environments is rarely about a single tool or tactic. It's about integrating knowledge of the terrain, material properties, and human behavior. Moss walls remind us that the most effective innovations are often simple, sustainable, and grounded in keen observation. In the extreme conditions of Northern Europe, a small investment of labor, harvesting, and fitting moss yielded disproportionately high returns in protection, stealth, and structural durability. Even today, understanding how pre-modern societies mitigated risk teaches us about adaptability. Human ingenuity is, often most visible in these quiet interventions: a wall that doesn't creak, a forest maintained for concealment, a resource harvested for multiple purposes. In a sense, the Vikings were practicing environmental literacy and risk management centuries before either term existed. Remembering these stories changes our perspective on history. The popular image of Vikings often reduces them to raiders, ignoring the sophistication of their communities and the depth of their environmental knowledge. Learning about moss-filled timber walls forces a reconsideration. These were people who survived and thrived not by chance, but by careful observation, planning, and an understanding of the subtle interplay between human activity and the natural world. Their choices reveal priorities that mattered in daily life as much as in war: stealth, endurance, and control over the immediate environment. In studying these overlooked tactics, we gain insight not only into Viking warfare, but into how societies adapt to constraints, leverage resources, and translate knowledge into practical advantage. It reminds us that every historical narrative has layers, and that quiet, unglamorous details often contain the richest lessons. The silent walls of the Vikings offer a final takeaway for anyone interested in history or survival. In life, as in warfare, mastery of small details can determine outcomes that appear at first glance to hinge on grander forces. Timber walls with moss may seem trivial compared to swords and longships, yet they reflect a disciplined, analytical approach to survival that resonates across centuries. By studying these practices, we honor not just the battles won, but the ingenuity that made daily life and any engagement possible. If this exploration of Viking environmental engineering and tactical subtlety has added depth to your understanding of history, subscribe to the channel for more nuanced examinations of overlooked strategies and forgotten practices. Sharing this video helps ensure that serious historical analysis reaches those who value it, keeping the lessons of the past alive for both study and practical application.